Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about what is quite possibly my favorite genre of role-playing games, the post-apocalyptic setting. And by post-apocalyptic, I mean an event that brings down the social structures that we know in the world today on a global scale. Not necessarily a localized event, not like how a war affects this particular region of the world, but when the entire cultural social structure is disrupted throughout the planet and the ensuing aftermath. Now, I have to freely admit I don't much enjoy playing in the immediate aftermath. I find it a little too real. I have too much of an easy time of projecting myself into that and trying to imagine how I would survive or quite possibly fail to survive and fail to take care of those I love, so it kind of depresses me. And since I suffer from depression, I don't need that. But if the game takes place, in the 30 plus years after the event or so, I'm okay with it. I feel a sense of distance and I'm comfortable with it. And the first game I was ever exposed to in this genre was Gamma World, the first edition version of it back in 1978. Which is completely wacky, wahoo science fantasy. It is not science fiction in the least. Now, over the years, I've collected a lot of science fiction, post-apocalyptic role-playing games. I have the largest collection of them of anyone I know. I love them. I find them fascinating. I enjoy seeing how different people handle the end of the world, what they do. Do they try to take a hard science fiction route? They fuse it with science fiction tropes like mutations and psionics and things like that. Do they throw caution out the wind and they bring in magic like Rifts did, things like that? Or do they just mash it all together and, have a potpourri of awesomeness? Now, one of the things that I have noticed over the years is that as my understanding of science has increased, the post-apocalyptic genre looks a little more threadbare as time goes by. I come to realize that it is in fact science fantasy, that there is very little science fiction to it. There have been a few attempts to be really scientific about it, and you could run that kind of a game. But the reality is that the era that would actually be post-apocalyptic isn't going to last that long. It isn't going to be measured in centuries. It's going to be measured in decades, possibly 2 generations, about 40 years. A generation is roughly 20 years. That's the normal term that generation usually refers to as 20 years. And beyond that, it ceases to be a post-apocalyptic setting. It just simply is a new world, based off the old, but with new cultures, new societies, new nations, new social structures, things like that, new subcultures. But it isn't Mad Max forever. It isn't Gamma World forever. Now, one of the things is that there's pretty much no way to achieve the kill-off levels that you really need to set up a great post-apocalyptic game. It just isn't possible. Even if at the height of the largest number of nuclear weapons, which we've passed that level, and there are fewer every year, even if they all had launched, which they wouldn't have done, and even if they all had functioned, which they wouldn't have, and even if they all had detonated, which they wouldn't have, the reality is that the planet wouldn't even have noticed, and the humans would have been rebounded after about 30 years. Not to previous levels, but to stable levels. And I'm basing this off research that was done in the 70s and 80s off of actual government researchers. That's even taking into account the whole global nuclear winter concept. So, if you want really high lethal levels, you're going to have to use some kind of disease as a base. Now, real diseases are only going to kill off about half the population at their worst. So you're going to have to come up with a fantasy disease, a disease that's even worse than reality. So say we have a weaponized version of Ebola, something which I pray no one is coming up with, but say we do. And it has a longer gestation period, so it gets to penetrate the entire population deeper before it kills you. Because Ebola in real life kills so quickly, it can't spread that fast. And it just kills people faster than they can get away from the disease. So it has to slow that down so they can get further away from the pandemic and spread it to a bigger area. Make it airborne, maybe. And make sure it doesn't break down in UV light, which a lot of diseases do, even weaponized versions. So say you get a 90% kill-off, which is almost impossible, but say you achieve it. And so that means that the world population is down to 600 million people. And we'll say that over the next 24 months, half of those die from the few nuclear missiles that get launched, chemical warfare, biological warfare of other varieties, just conventional warfare amongst people, and the diseases from there being over 5 billion corpses lying around. That would mean in the United States that after all this is said and done, you have a population of about 15 million in the U.S. That's not counting Canada and Mexico, that's the U.S. That's still a lot of people. And even if they were badly damaged, and say even half of those, you're going to have enough people to establish solid breeding stocks for the future relatively quickly. And because you're not going to get huge numbers of missiles, you're not going to get a lot of things wiped out as far as all the machines. There's not going to be that much of an EMP to deal with all the electronics. So a lot of electronics are going to survive. And it's important to remember that these right here, folks, you can see my camera. These right here aren't affected by EMPs. So all the movies, all the music, and everything that's stored on a CD or a DVD is going to survive. And as long as you have a handful of computers, you can revive them all. In addition, a basic blacksmith and a blacksmith forge can recreate all the technology of the 18th century. And that is the colonial era. Colonial era, the age of sail, conquered the world. With a competent water-powered system, when they exist here in New England and other places, you could recreate everything from the 19th century. 19th century is what the British Empire conquered the world even better. The age of steam. And if you have even a few functioning electrically powered machine shops, and we have a number of those in my town, plus a hydro dam, you could recreate everything up through about 1950, which is the era of World War II, which was pretty advanced. You're not going to be able to recreate circuit boards all that easily, but remember, there's going to be a lot of computers lying around that no one's using because the users are all dead. So the post-apocalyptic era isn't going to get as bad as people think it is. Now, just in my apartment, there are reference books, paper reference books, that would let you recreate a blacksmith, machine shops, boilers, steam engines, ammonia refrigeration, and yes, I have references for all of these, not to mention weapons reference books that vastly outnumber my city library. So that's just my apartment, not to mention lots of role-playing games they can occupy themselves in the aftermath. They can play post-apocalyptic role-playing games in the post-apocalyptic era. So, post-apocalyptic role-playing games are fantasy. Pure and simple. I love them, I will keep playing them, I will keep reading about them, I will keep discussing them, but they aren't realistic. They're never going to be realistic. There's never going to be Thunder the Barbarian. Don't let that stop you from playing it, folks. It's an awesome genre. But sometimes it bugs me when people think that just one little hiccup, like the end of the world, is going to stop our species from continuing.